So welcome everyone to EuropeanTech and AI, and today with our session on the Cultural AI Lab, Responsible AI and the Politics of Metadata. I'm really happy that we have so many registered participants for this session, and I'm really happy for all of you to get to know our speakers. If you wonder what this webinar series is all about, I'm gonna try to navigate this presentation. Just bear with me a second. Yeah, great. This is a webinar series that the EuropeanTech community has organized together with the Europeana Foundation. And it's a webinar series to explore the opportunities and challenges of working with artificial intelligence and machine learning in the cultural heritage and art sector. And this is our second session. We already had one 2 weeks ago, and I see that many of you already enjoyed that one. But we're going to have webinar sessions throughout spring and early summer. So keep an eye on our website and register for the other events that are coming up. And follow the hashtag EuropeanTechXAI on Twitter. There we are going to announce all the different news things coming up. Now I hopped over. Yes, exactly. Before we can actually start, we have to do some housekeeping. So please note this event will be recorded. So please be aware of that. And if you don't want to show up in the recording, don't open your camera for us. And if you write something in the chat, know that other people might read it, or that it might be recorded in some way. If you want to interact with us, check your username and use your first and last name, because that makes it easier for all of us to identify who we are answering to and discussing with. Please mute your microphone when you aren't speaking. And if you don't, be aware that I might do that, or help us in the background. If you need to leave for a second and you have your camera on, please turn that off. And we have two possibilities to interact with us. One is the chat, so you can, as you already do so well, use the chat to share your thoughts and comments or interact with each other. But we also have a Q&A document, and I'm going to link to that in the chat right now. So, but you can all leave your questions there, and speakers might answer you directly there, or we're going to take up your questions in the last part of this webinar. We ask you to follow our code of conduct, and I'm going to link to that one in the chat as well. But you find also the link in the chat in the Q&A session, in the Q&A document. And if you have any questions or you want to get in touch with us regarding something that you might feel uncomfortable or hurt by, you can find the contact details in the code of conduct. So that's all from my side, and thank you very much for joining us today. And I'm going to now introduce you to Johan Oman, who is my co-chair for today's webinar.
Yes, thanks, Larissa. So it was quite a pleasure to be asked to put together a nice program and to say, in a way, end the week on a high note. So we go to the, so our speakers. So today on the program, you will first get an introduction to the Cultural AI Lab that was kicked off earlier this year by one of the lab directors. Then followed by a presentation by Cindy and Valentin, who are involved in one of the current projects that are part of the lab. And then we give the floor to 3 projects that are taking place in the same realm and are touching upon similar issues that the Cultural AI Lab is concerned with. So first off, Nicolai of University of Antwerp, then my colleague Mari, who's sitting just 2 floors behind me, below me in the same building, and then Vendela, who is in Switzerland today, she mentioned just now. And we will close with a Q&A. So Larissa already shared the Q&A document, so make sure to enter your questions, considerations there, because this will help to run the Q&A session. And for the Q&A session, we will be joined by Marieke van Erp, who is at the Royal Academy of Science Digital Humanities Lab, and also one of the Cultural AI Lab directors. I think that's it for me. And enjoy. And I'm now going to hand over to Laura to give the first presentation.
Thank you very much, Johan. I will try to get my slides in there. Yeah, okay, that worked, thanks. Yeah, so it's really nice. I'm really happy to be able to be here and talk to you about the new Cultural AI Lab. Oh, let's see if I can, yeah. All right, so my name is Laura Hollink. I'm at the moment interim head of the Human-Centered Data Analytics Group at CWI, the Center for Math and Computer Science, and I'm one of the 3 directors of the Cultural AI Lab, together with Marieke van Erp, who will speak later today, as you heard, and Jacco van Ossenbrugge, who I think is watching at the moment. Okay. Yeah, so going to the next slide doesn't work, but I'll get it to work well. Well, anyway, in the lab, we have a really nice team. It's actually quite a large team already. So I wanted to show you all the faces, and we are growing. So I'll tell you a bit more about it, but it's really exciting to work with all these people. So what we want to do in the lab. So we want to bring cultural values into AI systems. So we want to design AI systems that can handle the complexities of human culture. So that can handle the subjective cultural data that we have in the humanities and in heritage institutes. So what I mean, for example, is how to handle something complex like bias, which is present in almost all of the data that humanities and heritage institutes work with. And it's because it's something that all humans have, and it's therefore present in all this data. So in this case, in our case, it does not make sense to try and erase the bias. And instead, we're interested in questions like, how can we measure this bias? How can we make it explicit? Which bias is acceptable in a system? Or how do we present this bias to a human user? Or another example is the complexity of cultural differences, or maybe in general, different perspectives that people may have on the same object or topics in a data set or in a collection. So these could be, for example, perspectives that have changed throughout history. So how do we make these explicit, and how do we design AI systems that can provide access to those perspectives while taking into account things like transparency and provenance? So these are a mix of technological questions and ethical questions, and they require a lot of knowledge of the domain and of the data. So to make all this work, we collaborate closely. And we see this collaboration between AI and humanities and heritage institutes not as a one-way street, but as a, let's say, as a two-way street, where both fields learn from each other. And I think that, well, in my experience, what sometimes happens in interdisciplinary projects is that it's more of a one-way street where, for example, AI sees humanities as just a nice test case of their awesome tools. And maybe humanities would maybe see AI as just a bunch of programmers to scale up the analysis that they already did. Which is actually, that's actually also may work very well in some situations. But in this lab, we want to go one step further and really collaborate in the sense that both fields both fields are able to grow from the insights of the other field. Anyway, so with these ambitious plans in terms of collaboration, we had, what we wanted was that all the researchers in the lab, so the PhD students and the postdocs that we had, would actually spend time together, spend time not only at the academic partners, but also at the heritage partners. And we wanted to do data sprints where we would all be together for a couple of days and work on the same data set. But yeah, since we're all working from home, that didn't happen. Same as that, some of the nice events that we planned in the beautiful research library of the Rijksmuseum that you can see here hasn't happened. But on the other hand, we did find really, really good ways of collaboration through Slack, for example. So the interdisciplinary collaboration that we wanted is definitely there. We have a reading club on Zoom, which is running really well. Yeah, I think in that sense, things are not going as planned, but they're going well anyways. So these are the projects that we currently have in the lab. At the moment, 4 projects are running. Most of them started in January. So that's, yeah, feels like just a couple months ago. And a couple projects are upcoming. So for these, we are currently either hiring, or we have just hired somebody that will start later, or we're about to start hiring. So this is what I meant when I said the lab will grow. Yeah, we'll get more projects in and more people joining as well. Okay, so what I want to do now is actually give you a couple of concrete examples of the themes or the things that we work on in the lab to make it a bit more concrete. But for full disclosure, I also want to say that from these 3 examples, only the first one, so this one, the one you're looking at right now, is something that we have actually done, let's say, officially within the lab. The other 2 are things that we've done in the years before the start of the lab, because while the Cultural AI Lab is new, the collaborations are old, right? We've been working with these partners in different combinations for years leading up to this lab. So the other 2 examples that I'm going to give is work that we've done in those years. But yeah, this one. So we got a small grant from EuropeanTech to build a data set, an AI machine learning data set on the Europeana data. And what we want to do with that grant is build what we call the contentious context corpus. So we've taken part of the Europeana data. It's actually the part that was provided by the Dutch, the National Library, KB. So they're Dutch newspapers, historic newspapers. And we're now labeling that data set with whether or not these news articles contain a contentious term. And a contentious term here is a term that could be racist or sexist or offensive or otherwise inappropriate from the perspective that we have right now, from this moment in time. So we ask people to look at the word, including some context in the article, and then decide whether it's contentious or not. And we're going to use this data set to bootstrap and evaluate some automatic methods for detecting these contentious terms in cultural heritage collections. So we see this is a small step, but it's a first step towards this bigger goal that we have of making explicit maybe bias in data or the perspective from which a certain data set is created. Okay, so then I have another example, which is, so this was done a couple, oh, it doesn't show, that's a pity. So I had, okay, well, it doesn't show my picture, the slide. Well, anyways, this is an example of work that was done by Mirjam Traub. She was a PhD student of Jacco van Ossenbrugge, who's one of the directors of the lab. They wrote a paper about it, which was supposed to show on the slide, but it's not there for some reason. But anyway, what Mirjam did was she looked again at the National Library newspapers to see if there was maybe not so much bias in the data, but bias in the search algorithms that the library uses. So she took all the queries that actual users post in the library, reran them, and then looked at the results that they got. And what she found was that not all articles have an equal chance of actually coming up in the search results. Actually, the vast majority of the articles, 96%, never made it into the top 10 of the search results, so would never be seen by users usually. And and that very large, very short and very long documents would have a much lower chance of being in that top 10. And that articles that contain long lists of names, like local elections and swimming diplomas, would actually have a very big chance of being in the top 10. So what this means is that the search algorithm apparently discriminates a bit. So if, for example, one part of the collection, so it could be that one part of the collection hardly ever shows up in people's search result, not because the content doesn't match, but just because the properties of these documents, like length or number of names in it, don't or do match with what the search engine is good at retrieving. Ah, there it is. Okay, sorry. That's the article. Okay, so one final example, and then I'll stop. This is an example from the NewsGag project. We also wrote a paper about that with Ayshnul Bilgin and people from the eScience Center and people from University of Groningen. And what we wanted to do was make a machine learning pipeline and make it transparent so that people from the humanities could use it in a responsible way, basically in a trusted way. So what we did is we built a dashboard in which people could enter some data, select the data preparation steps, choose an algorithm, all by just clicking, and then see the results of running that algorithm of the data on the data. So they could basically click together a machine learning pipeline and then really in detail inspect the results. And the idea was that then people could compare these pipelines and because of that, make a decision on which pipeline would fit best for their research question, because it gave the best results on their research question without having to understand each part of the pipeline. So I'll walk you through some of the results. This is two of these outputs of two different pipelines. And I'm going to, so the pipelines are, the one is called SVZ and the other is called RF. Well, it doesn't matter, that's just a name. I'm already going to tell you that the first one is overall much better. So what you want to see to pick the best algorithm is the darkest blobs in this diagonal line. So we know that the first one is better. However, if you look at one specific class in this task that the user was doing, namely if you want to detect whether some text is actually a feature. Okay, I should have explained this. So we were doing genre classification, right? If a text is, we wanted to see if a text is an interview, a feature, a report, a review, a background article, or a column. But then we can see that on the feature class, actually the second pipeline performs much better. So what I want to show with this is that by looking at the result, a user may be able to decide that the second pipeline would be better for her results, while she wouldn't know this if she would just have looked at the overall results. Okay, so these were three examples of the themes that we're working on. I hope I gave you some ideas. If you want to get in touch, or for example, if you want to become part of the lab, just contact us. All the details are on our website, and we're also on Twitter. So now I'm gonna give the floor to Cindy and Valentine from the Sabio project.
Thank you, Laura. My name is Cindy Zalm and I'm head of collection management of the National Museum of World Cultures in the Netherlands, a museum that doesn't exist because it's the cooperative organization behind 4 separate museums, namely the Wereldmuseum in Rotterdam, the Afrika Museum in Nijmegen, the Tropenmuseum in Amsterdam, and Museum Volkenkunde in Leiden. And this is 4 institutes that which histories are deeply defined by the Dutch colonial history. And the narratives being told in those museums have been for a very long time about how we view the other, as we would name that. A few years ago, we invited a group called Decolonize the Museum, with people from various backgrounds to visit our museum, the Tropenmuseum initially, and assess whatever story has been told in that museum and how they would evaluate it. Would they consider some of it inappropriate, for example? That resulted in a very critical report that not only talked about the labels next to the exhibits that we produced, but also the entire experience of visiting the museum. It resulted in a publication by RCMC, our research institute. And okay, I have been impatient with going through the slides. I'm sorry for that. It resulted in the publication Words Matter, where we collected 50 of the most troublesome terms and assembled them in the publication Words Matter, where we explained the background of those terminologies, the history of it, and why it could be inappropriate or considered offensive for certain people in our society. But it's not only about the words we use in our text labels. This first step by Decolonize the Museum was an invitation to be very critical about the practice of our museum as an institute in itself. And most of the terminology used in our texts on the exhibitions originate from our databases to describe the objects we collect, and that's more than 450,000 objects in total. The information in those digital databases originate from card systems. And card systems is not just a paper version of documentation assembled, but it's part of a bureaucratic system that is very contextual and historical. It is a means to categorize and classify objects that is being based on the contemporary institutional knowledge of that time. So also defined by the view of the other, and defined by anthropology and material culture in our institutes. So in those databases and the card systems, the afterlives of colonialism is very present. And it's not only about the afterlives of colonialism, because there is also terminology that is related to gender that can be viewed from very different perspectives. We use the terms in Words Matter, this selection of 50, to go through our database and to review the descriptions and the labels and the titles that we use in there and read done them. But that has been a very extensive effort. So we were very enthusiastic when we heard about the Sabio project, because the Sabio project tries to discover whether or not AI can help us go through that process. And what is obvious for us as a colonial institute or a former colonial institute could also help a lot of other institutes, but because the systems being used by other Dutch institutes or institutes in Europe are probably defined by the same history as ours, although it's less obvious. So I will give the floor to Valentin to explain what this Sabio project is all about.
Thank you very much, Cindy. Yeah, like Cindy said, I'm working on the Sabio project together with her as the heritage partner and together with Marike from the Cultural AI Lab. Could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Yeah, so as Cindy described, bias is a very high-dimensional, very complex problem that has very complex definitions. And so as a computer scientist or as a computational scientist, my starting point would be to try and find a definition for bias so that I can teach that to the computer. But then as we found out more and more and as we researched more and more into how we could define bias for the computer, we kind of realized that bias detection, which was our initial goal, is actually not our goal now anymore. We shifted to navigation. And part of the reason for that is because, or our crucial insight for that was that defining bias is difficult or near impossible for us because there are probably no universally agreed definitions of bias, of what bias is. And even so, we couldn't really find a narrow enough definition to, for any given specific example, have the computer judge whether this is a case of bias or not. So we shifted to navigation, And there, during our discussions, we came up with the camera metaphor. That's why you see a camera in this picture. Because that's how we envision the navigation algorithm, namely that we all see the same world, let's say, but then we look through the camera and suddenly we have perspective, right? We have different parameters, we have different filters in the camera. And so these could correspond to our own perspectives, goals, and contexts that we as humans, we as people who look into, for instance, a database of the heritage institutes, and have while we're trying to find instances of biases or generally investigate bias. A second aspect that we thought is really relevant, or that we really care about, is that investigating bias is not really like a lot of other questions into databases, but it is actually sort of more a social action, in the sense that if I investigate bias, it will tell me something about society. It will educate me about society, and it will maybe even educate me about myself, where I am with respect to these biases, or it could educate me about how I might shift my own definitions of biases. So we ended up with a very strong shift to navigation and from detection. If you go to the next slide. This actually also helps us avoid a bit what people call the black box problem in AI and machine learning. And I would say that the solution to go to navigation is actually in close relationship to this black box problem. What do I mean by that? I mean that our algorithms and interfaces that we develop in the context of Sabio, so that we can help people investigate bias in these heritage collections with computational means, that these algorithms and interfaces, they should be both open and intuitive. By open, I mean that we as the computer scientists, we develop algorithms that we can open up, where we have insights onto how the parameters of the algorithms change, what outputs they give, and what they have actually learned. And so if I do that, if I open it up, then I get basically pictures like the ones that I showed here. These are from actual initial experiments that we carried out. And it doesn't really matter what's on them. I think, as you can see, and there's probably a lot of people in the field know, and these outputs can be quite complicated and messy to people from outside of the field. And so that actually kind of violates the intuitiveness requirement, right? Which is actually also about accessibility. So when we talk about bias, everyone could be affected by it. So everyone should actually also have the right to be able to investigate biases at the end of the day. So we really need intuitive interfaces. And so actually here we have a bit of a trade-off. That's one thing that we realized. We don't really have a solution yet, but it's just, I think it's just important that we are aware of it. And so finally, in the final slide, I would actually like to advertise two things. And this basically stems from the realization that we as computer scientists, we're not experts, domain experts on what bias is. Other people are, and other people have made much more detailed and intricate experiences with bias, much more than we have. And so for that reason, we built a questionnaire where we want to ask practitioners on heritage data, researchers on bias, and social scientists on how they navigate and encounter bias in data. And if they were given a navigational tool like the one that we're building, what would they expect from it? This is open until the 14th of May. And I'm posting the link in the chat now. So please do feel invited to take the questionnaire. It would greatly help us to build a better tool that is accessible and useful for everyone. And the second thing that we're actually building out of this questionnaire is a workshop where we'll more thoroughly introduce our tool and the ideas that we have, and then in focus breakout sessions discuss them, namely all of the different parts, which is the heritage focuses, different kinds of algorithms, more the philosophical side. So how do we define bias? What different levels and types of biases do we think that we might encounter? And finally, the very concrete user interfaces with their interface designer. This workshop is on the 19th of this month. And I also posted the link together with the questionnaire. And if you do want to join, hurry up, because we only have 20 spots available. So they will be gone fast. And thank you. And now I'm excited what the next presentation has to say.
Hi, Nikolai. Is everything working for you, or do you need any help?
Yes, it works.
Great.
Hello. Hello, everyone. My name is Nikolai. I'm a PhD student at the University of Antwerp. And today I'm going to present the Insight project and discuss in more detail a part which is devoted to icon class codes retrieval. Let's start with the context of the Insight project. It's a collaboration of 3 Belgian universities and 2 museums in Brussels. The project is funded by BELSPO, which is a federal funding agency for science in Belgium. And we aim to leverage AI technology to support smaller heritage institutions in their digitizing and cataloging efforts. Often these smaller institutions have only a limited budget or human power, and we explore how AI can help them in their efforts. In our project, we have fundamental goals. First, we aim to explore and apply transfer learning, which helps to overcome the issue of limited data. And in addition, we would like to investigate how we can exploit multimodality of museum data. We also have applied research goals, which are translation of metadata, icon class codes retrieval, and identification of different objects such as musical instruments, fruits, mammals, etc. Further, I'm going to discuss a part of the Insight project, which is about icon class codes retrieval. Let's start with a description of icon class. Icon class is an iconography classification system used in the cultural heritage domain to describe and retrieve subjects represented in the visual arts. Here, each subject represented in icon class is assigned a unique icon class code that includes keywords and definitions in multiple languages. This artwork to the left is assigned an icon class code with the definition David communicating with God, David praying in general. So in total, icon class contains a set of 28,000 hierarchically ordered definitions and 14,000 keywords. And as you can see, icon class codes assigning is a complex interpretive task which is typically carried out by highly trained subject experts. And the task is especially challenging because of large number of available codes. So what is the task? We aim to assign these icon class codes, namely definitions, to artworks. You have already seen an example of such definition. In addition, artwork objects can contain visual and textual metadata, and we would like to exploit it using multimodal matching. And our data set contains Dutch and English titles and images of artworks. Let's discuss a bit a model that we used in our task. It's a framework, Self-Attention Embeddings Framework, or SIEM, and it is a framework for image-to-text matching, and it consists of 2 branches in order to process text and images. The general idea is that this network processes an image and some text and provides a similarity or relevancy score. Hence, we can say that one icon class code is more similar or relevant to this image in comparison to another icon class code. And yeah, I think that's all about technical details. And also we propose some kind of extension for this framework. And in our work, in our data set, we have available both textual and visual sources for the matching task. And we process the available textual information with the text branch and process the available visual information with the image branch. And we obtain multimodal representation for our art objects. About data sets that we used, we used a data set extracted from the database of the Netherlands Institute for Art History. It consists of approximately 26,000 objects and their corresponding icon class codes. And we just used icon class codes with a depth of 5, and it gave us approximately 10,000 icon class codes that we used as labels for our task. And for evaluation, we used standard metric recall K, which represents the portion of relevant items found in the top K retrieved labels. Here it's icon class codes. And about results, what we got in this research. So here we report the performance of the models for image, text, or multimodal query versus the icon class definitions. It means that based on these data sources, image and titles that you see in the table, the network tries to find a suitable icon class code. And we refer to models with multiple sources, D, E, F, and G, as to multimodal models. And as you can see, model A for image to text matching demonstrates low results in comparison to models B and C that use textual features for matching. So in our task, only textual information is very useful. Another interesting observation is that the model trained on the Dutch titles performs similarly with the corresponding model trained on the English titles. If we talk about multimodal matching here, multimodal matching is the best performer, and we also observe that increased number of sources improves the quality of matching. As you can see from this example, icon class matching is a challenging task due to the hierarchical structure and the high number of similar codes. In this example, the first 7 labels have the same upper code and are highly similar to each other. That makes the matching task extremely difficult. And in order to learn such subtle differences of meaning, the model would probably need even more properly annotated data. And some final slides. So what we found in this small research that the visual features for our task are not promising in comparison to textual features. We also showed that cross-lingual matching using the Dutch language artwork titles works as good as matching that uses the English language artwork titles. And this finding will be useful for heritage institutions around the world because they usually have metadata in local languages. And hence, they don't need to translate metadata to English to match icon class codes. And finally, our proposed method was the best performer. And in the future work, we would like to extend our data set and also to re-implement this It seems that there is a bit problem with slides. Yeah. We would like to implement the SIAM framework, because this framework has limited capabilities and cannot be fine-tuned. So we would like to use transfer learning and to fine-tune this network. And also in the future work, we would like to exploit the hierarchical structure of icon class codes. That's all that I wanted to say. If you have any questions about our work or icon class codes, I would be glad to answer them. The next presenter is Marie from Netherlands Institute for Sound and Vision.
Thank you, Nicola. Just test if this remote control is working. Right, I will first look at the data story that we recently published based on the Dutch elections. And then I will zoom out a bit more to look at how data stories can be used as a means to collaborate between AI and humanities. It's almost impossible these days to imagine elections without the media. So that makes that who is talked about on the media and who gets to appear on the media very important. And traditionally, these questions are answered by manual analysis of television and radio programs, which takes a long time and so naturally limits the scope of such studies. AI and data give us the opportunity to look at a much bigger picture. We looked at more than 1,200 broadcasts of 58 public service programs from the Dutch television and radio. And we had a list of the more than 1,700 candidates for Dutch elections, along with their gender and party where they had published that. We deliberately did not attempt to detect gender, as that is a contentious issue. For 220 of those politicians, we had face and/or voice models to be able to detect them in video and audio. Given all these resources, we had two methods to try and look at how politicians featured in the media. In the first, we ran all the programs through a speech recognizer to produce text transcripts, and searched in those text transcripts for the names of the candidates. In this way, we could measure the number of times a politician was mentioned. The advantage of this method is it can detect all of the politicians in that list, as all you need is the name. Now, one disadvantage is that it is sensitive to errors in speech recognition. For example, the Dutch politician Thierry Baudet was often recognized as the fruit cherry, which meant that his mentions were underestimated. Another issue is that there's a large variation in how names are used. If we just look at this short fragment, then the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte is referred to both as Premier Rutte and just by his surname, Rutte. Now, the more variations we search for, the more mentions we find, but also the bigger the chance of detecting someone else, perhaps who has the same surname, or even detecting something that is not a person at all. If, for example, you have the Dutch surname Boom, which is also the word for tree. These weren't issues that we experienced in this particular study, as we were fortunate enough that the most popular politicians in the Netherlands don't have these sort of surnames, but it would be something that would play a role in a larger list of names. And the second method, we looked at the results of face and speaker recognition. So we could measure the number of times a politician appeared or spoke, but also how long the politician appeared or spoke for. Now, advantage with this method is that you can be sure that you have a person. The disadvantage is that it is sensitive, of course, to errors in the speaker or face recognition. These models do perform very well, but they're not perfect. And a bigger disadvantage is that we only have models for a selected set of persons. In this case, we had 220 of the politicians, which covered the politicians who appear frequently in the media. If we'd been looking perhaps at fringe parties or politicians who are unexpectedly becoming popular, then that would have been more difficult. Now, with these methods, we could produce some very interesting results. Now, some of these you might expect. For example, men were mentioned far more frequently than women, more than 3 times as much. And also the politicians from the governing coalition spoke for much longer than those who were in the opposition, and certainly than those who were in parties that weren't even in the parliament yet at all. Something else that might be expected is that within each party, the person who spoke the most was the leader of that party. We also had some surprising results. While women appeared much less frequently than men, when they did appear, they spoke longer than men on average, slightly more than 2 minutes as opposed to slightly more than 1 minute for the men. And there's often a perception that the media has a left-wing bias or tends towards more attention for left-wing politicians. Well, that was certainly not the case. We found that right-wing politicians were mentioned more frequently. Our side effect of our official scientific results was a great deal of media attention. These results were picked up on by the Dutch television, radio, newspapers, and websites, and repeated in many different forms. Now, we naturally faced some challenges in producing this data story. Given the variability of television and radio schedules, just ensuring that we had all the broadcasts of those 1,200 plus programs was far from a trivial task. It took a great deal of very careful checking to make sure that our data was complete. We also had to check that our results were correct, but also that they were verifiable so that we could demonstrate to other people that what we had done was correct. So we built tests into the code itself and generated extra outputs that could be checked and verified. And finally, an important challenge was to communicate the scope and limitations of this study. All the information I've told you so far about how we went about making the data story is necessary in order to be able to correctly interpret the results. You really need to have the story behind the data story. Now, the data story was a big success, and we're currently working on analysing the data to see which topics are most associated with certain political parties or certain genders. And in the future, we will extend analysis to look into gender in the media more broadly. So this is just the first in a series of data stories. I think the key reason for the success of this data story lies in this slide, in the team that came together to create the data story. It was very multidisciplinary. There were people from all walks of life. And that brings me on to the subject of how we can use data stories as an opportunity to encourage collaboration between AI and humanities. I would suggest that it's actually impossible to write a good data story without including lots of different disciplines. If we look at the process of a data story, it starts with a question, such as which politicians are speaking in the media. That tends to come from the domain, from people who are interested in politics or interested in the media. But you can't answer that question directly from data. You need to formulate it in terms of something that you can measure. The number of mentions of a name in a piece of text, or the length of time that someone's voice is recognized. And to be able to do that, you need a data or AI expert who knows what data is available and what techniques are available for analyzing it, and which might be suitable for answering the question. But you also need an archive expert who knows how that data was produced in the first place, because that process can also influence the results. For example, face and speaker recognition is not done for all archive content at present. It's done for selected genres. That's a very important thing to know when comparing appearances across different genres of programs. And the next step then is to, once the question has been formulated, is to produce the data, and the data expert can do that and generate results. But then in the final step of interpreting the data, all the groups need to come together again. The data expert needs to explain what they did and how that is represented in the results. The domain expert has the necessary broader context to be able to really interpret what those results mean and how they answer the original question. We also need the archive expert to be able to look carefully, critically at the results and say that looks like a really interesting pattern, but it has nothing to do with your question. It has to do with archive artifacts as to how the data was generated. What we found is that once you come to the answer to a question, it always provokes more questions. every time you come up with some other question. So this process goes through an iterative loop over and over again. And in fact, you have to be quite strict and break it off at some point to go and publish, because it's a never-ending story. And this continual interaction between the groups we found it incredibly inspiring and creative process. And it really makes you learn a great deal from each other. Every group benefits from working together on a data story. And the advantage of data stories is that the scale can vary widely. You can start with a simple one graphic with one sentence of explanation in a tweet, or it could go all the way up to a full study of election data. You have every possibility in between, and more complicated data stories can use simpler data stories as building blocks. And that brings me on to what we're going to be doing in the future, which is to build a community around the Media Suite, which is a tool that allows researchers access to various archives and tools with which they can analyze them. And we want to make a place where all sorts of experts can share, for example, a data source, some code for carrying out common processing on that data, an intermediate result that's interesting, and of course, a full data story, so that they can continually inspire each other, learn from each other, and ultimately collaborate. Now I'm going to hand over the floor now, and we're now going to hear about metadata as a diversity tool.
Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here to share my work with you. This work is a socially engaged research practice rooted in the arts and the humanities. I have a background as a photographer, which led me to do a PhD in art history in 2016 on digital interfacing and glitch art online, exploring the integration of technical norms and social norms and visual norms. And this led me on to do a postdoc on photography and visual impairment, so working on blind photographers, essentially. And this cross-disciplinary framework, drawing on art history and media studies and disability studies, led me into the project that I will be sharing with you today. So metadata as a diversity tool is a study within a larger project being conducted at Department of Cultural Aesthetics at Stockholm University. It's called The Politics of Metadata, and it's run by the Metadata Culture Research Group, led by Anna Dahlgren and Karin Hansson. And this study that I conducted is part of that, and it's was conducted last year in the autumn. So this is fresh and will be presented in publication later this year. So the theme of this study, metadata as a diversity tool, is to explore metadata as a tool that both enables and complicates diversity as a spectrum of perspectives expressed in the description of images. So this idea of diversity as a spectrum, you'll find both in institutional definitions, like the UNESCO Declaration of Cultural Heritage, but also in more vernacular understandings, like in encyclopedias, for instance. And the idea here is to look at both how metadata is an enabling tool, so for instance, by optimizing searchability, but also to see how it can complicate things in a productive way. So how metadata can be used to study what this searchability might exclude and the implications of that. So the aim of the study was to analyze how metadata shapes the conditions of cultural heritage representation, with a focus on Sami cultural heritage in the online image archive of the Swedish National Heritage Board, and a comparison between their institutional database, Kulturmiljöbild, and the social media platform Flickr Commons, to investigate how these images transform when mediated on these two sites. So to look at the metadata both as it enables these images to communicate a spectrum of perspectives, but also how it might make things more complicated. And make that complication transparent to researchers like myself wants to explore this, but also to end users. So this material is images by and of an ethnic minority in Sweden, across the Scandinavian area, whose images can then be found in the archives of one of the oldest government archives in Sweden, responsible for cultural heritage since the early 1600s. So this ethnic minority has been in long-standing and ongoing conflict with the Swedish state, and you can find these images in the state archive. As this archive is going online in search for a diverse audience. So the questionnaire is, how does metadata shape the conditions of cultural heritage representation so that the visual framing of a plurality of heritages in online archives may facilitate diversity? So this visual framing has to do with the images themselves and also the interfaces that they are embedded into and how they work precisely with the metadata to enable or disable certain types of narratives around the images. And I'm trying again to change. Here we are. I'm approaching this question through a framework of democracy, identity formation, visual culture. So for instance, drawing on Nancy Fraser's three-part theorization on democratic justice being achieved through recognition, redistribution, and representation. So through processes of acknowledging, facilitating, and communicating the spectrum of perspectives that would underpin diversity. And to understand this through a performative perspective on visual culture. So not just to see images as mirrors of their own conditions, just as carriers of cultural heritage, but also to see them as generating the discourses that they are embedded into and see them as cultural heritage in their own right. And so the approach is part of a broader critical data studies, starting with metadata extraction, using the Flickr's own API, which is available on the platform, out of an interest to see how and what the platform itself would make available to a user. Extracting the image tags from the SNHB archive on Flickr Commons, looking specifically at identity markers, then doing image searches on 4 terms, Sami, Same, Samisk, and Sapmi. So different terms both in Swedish, English, and in the Sami language. Following up with a close reading of a selection of these images within their layout. And also talking to the person who single-handedly has actually produced and filtered all these Flickr tags, Anna Boman at the SNHB. So let's see, we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this is how it looks online, the Swedish National Heritage Board. What we found straight off was that in terms of identity markers, ethnicity was marked very low. In fact, there were only 3 images that were tagged Sami or something Sami related. But I had a visual memory of having seen more going through the images on the website. So out of almost 2,000 images, there was only 3 images that were tagged in this way. So this is also something, as a researcher, how important that visual memory and that visual literacy plays into a project like this. So I knew I had seen more than what the data told me was there. And what the image that I had remembered, you can see it on the right here, the image with the girl and the dog, the girl with the red bonnet. This became the starting point of digging deeper into which images actually were there in the archive and what the narratives were around them with regards to the Sami heritage. Next slide, please. So looking a little bit closer on this, we can see on the Flickr post that actually it makes no mention of Sami. You can see the tags here on the right. The institution tags itself, of course, omnipresent, but you can also see different features of the landscape, of nature. The dog is tagged, and the medium of photography. But you don't see anything about the Sami heritage, neither there or in the caption or in any other of the data elements. If we on the other hand go to the institution's database itself, which is on the next slide, if you want to change, please. Thank you. It actually doesn't show up in the search on any of the Sami terms either. It only shows up when I search for the photographer's name. The image came up. But some of the other things that came up were images, for instance, of spiritual objects acquired by the institution over the centuries, as well photographs documenting cultural practices of the Sami, but as well, for instance, images of Sami working in the state-owned mining company on Sami territory, as well images depicting the Christianization of the Sami people. So certainly images with a very contested story around it, where you could certainly work with the metadata to make these stories known, but where at the same time the system is not really built for that kind of transparency. So a lot of that story kind of just fades away. If we look at the image of the girl and dog here, it's actually categorized as building construction, which then leads on to a Sami settlement. And it's categorized as well as family life. So it's hard to find it straight away. You have to kind of go in a roundabout way to find it through the Sami settlement category. So this as well is just to give two examples of how it looks, just one single image on these two platforms. If we go to the next slide, please. Just to sum up some of the results of this study. We certainly, very unsurprisingly, find biases. It's habitual in an archive like this, a white Eurocentric male bias. If we look at, for instance, the identity markers, which people are depicted most often and how they are, who is named, for instance, and so on. We see, in terms of searchability, what I would call a metadata mismatch. So where some images that could have been tagged Sami are not. Others show up in the search with these search terms without having anything in the available metadata that indicates that particular identity, and the images sort of get lost in between. Interestingly enough, you can see what I call a curatorial workaround. So where the manager is working very consciously with the interface. So for instance, this is how my visual memory was generated, placing this very compelling image of the girl and the dog in a very central position in the display, where the blue of the mountains are offset by her red bonnet. So I'm working really with the visuality to create visibility for the image and for the heritage that is embedded within it. Even though then looking closer, it's actually not tagged in this way to sort of follow up this. But you can see how you can use the interface, the display, and the design in this way to create to create a kind of semblance of diversity that is actually not representative of the archive, but is representative of the commitment that the institution is active in, being committed to the UNESCO declaration, for instance, by being a state agency. So you can see a kind of intention working with what you have in this way, by particularly working with the visuality of the images together in the interface display. As well, as you can see an example of here, and I'll talk you through these last examples as well very briefly. But you can see in the left slide that there is a caption printed on the postcard. And this is a way to work with metadata. This is kind of metadata embedded in the physical materiality of the object. In this case, it depicts the Sami schools, and on the print you see it being termed as nomadskolekotor, so it's a nomadic school huts, while in the written caption you see it's saying Sami school huts. So this is as well a way for the institution to work with a potentially derogatory language, to not erase it from the archive, but to work with a second caption to add metadata that somehow sets in relation the change here from one type of terminology to another. So you catch a story with the help of that. And you can use as well the categories, the keywords to kind of expand on the story. As well, in this case, you see that there are added links to maps, which is very interesting in terms of the Sami and the territory that I told you just briefly earlier about the mining, but also links to further information. And here, actually, the manager has added a link to the Nordic Museum website. And this is a direct response to a reaction from a user. You see the long post on the right here, where the user is actually giving the story of the school huts and the Sami school system with all its very complicated and contested elements. I don't have time to go into all of that now, but just to give you an example, you see then the institution responding directly to this user and saying thank you for this important and interesting information, and adding a link that the user is providing. So this brings me to the next point in our results, the importance of crowdsourcing here, both in terms of reframing narratives by contributing facts, information that can be integrated into the interface, but also kind of showing how the user is so important to curate their own access to heritage. So in terms of representation, which was the aim that we started in this study, you can see that there is a hidden heritage in this archive that is hidden with good intention. So it's clear that they don't want to mark out ethnicity, and at the same time, it's there, it's ever present, but it becomes hidden in a classificatory system that brings on its own kind of problems. So the contribution here, I think, it's a very small scale study, but as a case, it generates an example that can be combined with other cases, and it also gives the opportunity to dig deeper instead of taking the full-on broad quantitative approach. Going into details in a qualitative manner also makes a methodological contribution. A challenge in this project that I want to bring to the floor as well is using metadata both as your object of study and as your method to study this object, and how you are always implicated in the process as a researcher, by generating the data that you want to study. So how you, and this is of course a problem with any type of question that you ask to any material, that the question also brings on its own structures that you are imposing on what you're trying to study. But in this case, when you find these possibilities of opening up metadata, making the process transparent, making the history transparent, adding different captions, linking to a further networked environment of information, it also becomes interesting to work in this way. And this brings us to the final question, which is about best practices in this regard. There's a strong case in the research for the diversity descriptors. So descriptors that would specifically pinpoint ethnicity. At the same time, you are also then pinpointing ethnicity, calling out the deviation from a norm, and this has been shown in scholarship as well, that in the commitment to diversity, you might mark out Black but not white, because the white is the norm, and it's about making these things explicit and visible, and possible to change. So this is a topic for discussion. I want to thank you for your attention. You can go to the last slide, which just says thank you. And if you have any comments or questions, please contact me and read more about the research group's work online. And thank you for your attention.
So well done, speakers. It's a fabulous work and also fabulously presented. Larissa, I was looking at the Q&A document, and miraculously, many of the questions have been answered by the speakers. So how do you want to move forward? We have at least, say, 10 minutes for questions.
Exactly. So I think this is a great opportunity to actually show the synergy effects also that we have between the projects. And if there was any question that you consider you want to start with, Johan, you can already just go ahead. I mean, we have a couple of minutes left, and
yeah, sure. So for those who arrived later, if you we are working in a Q&A document. Maybe it's good, Larissa, if we share it once more. There's one open question that was just added and directed to both Cindy and Vendela about how do insights with respect to bias in catalogs impact cataloging practices. Cindy, would you like to say a few words maybe?
I think they are interlinked, and it is a bit troublesome, because as soon as you want to keep the old information as well, use new words or new text to describe your objects, you're demanding something from your cataloging system that in a lot of cases is not possible. So on the technical side of the database, we have to find ways to improve that, I would say. Because it's getting more and more complex to search those databases if you don't understand the history of them. So if you only dump so much information on the internet, and that's the main source for many researchers, then you're missing out on a lot of historical context, I would say.
I would actually like to ask a question that I think we don't have discussed broadly in the Q&A doc, and that's diversity on the side of those who are asking actually the questions and are designing the technology. So I mean, if we look at the round of speakers right now, we, for example, are mostly would be read as white European people. So how does that actually is also in a part of the research that you're doing, or how are you reflecting on this?
That's a really good question. Thanks, Larissa. I think that we certainly shouldn't refrain from addressing these questions just because of who we are. I mean, it's something that implicates everyone, and we all need to see that and try to work together. It's as well tricky in terms of, I'm thinking in terms of, for instance, expanding annotations or expanding control terms and these kinds of things to try to improve on cataloging systems. This is also raises questions. How would you put together test user groups? How could you work in an open workshop format where you are on how to say, where you can work as a community, whereas you don't have the hierarchy as well between the academic scholars and the end users somehow, but where we could create an open climate where we can put biases on the table, no matter who or what they concern. This could be a way to kind of get at these layered histories or layered narratives that these images, for instance, carry and generate and keep generating as they are circulating online as well. So I think we have to think about different kinds of platforms where that could be possible. And this would hopefully then as well include, of course, programmers and builders on the tech side.
Yeah, I think, for example, in New Zealand, they are having a really interesting project on incorporating and collaborating actively with Maori community members to work also on the curating side of the project. So if you all, I mean, oh, sorry, Angela.
Sorry, I just have to say one thing as well. It's and this is a tricky part of why this is so complicated as well in terms of identity is as well how you would then label a potential user group, saying this the Sami, and already creating a kind of unity or a semblance of unity as well. I know in this particular group there is an ongoing conflict about Swedishness and being defined by Swedes as Sami or Swedes or not, and how it's important in some cases to absolutely not be Swedish, and in other cases, you know, you want to be. And so this is something to take into account as well, that by this good intention about promoting diversity, you might as well just add more groups, more classes, more categories. So this is something to keep your mind on.
Absolutely. And I would also say that, I mean, that's why it's so important to incorporate those perspectives in the project as well, because we might not be aware of those notions ourselves. Anyone else in the audience having last questions before we close this session?
Hello, I have a question.
Yes.
I would like to ask, all that has been presented is, I don't know how to explain, but sounds little strange. It's mean that I expected more concrete ways to use AI in the archival. Mostly I am occupied with the audiovisual archiving. Did you think that concentration on resolving of, let's say, current problems, for example, semi-automated restoration, would be also the subject that need largely discussing, because right now I saw that community discuss on problems that is very general, and AI is viewed like an instrument or like a tool, much more complicated and much more powerful than it is in reality. I hope you understand exactly my question. Thank you.
I'm not quite sure that I got your question right. If there's anyone from the speakers who might want to respond, otherwise I would actually encourage you to have a look at our series program, and if there's something up for you in the next sessions that seems more fitting to your individual focus of work. But Does anyone of the speakers want to jump in here?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to give, I'm not sure if that's going to be a very satisfying answer, but a lot of the heritage institutions we are working with are using AI and developing AI together with researchers to aid restoration or to digitize and make machine interpretable their collections. For example, the National Library is doing a lot of work on OCR and handwriting recognition, but these are complementary. So, and I think also their biases in those tools can play a role. I think recently there was a whole thing about these automatic colorations of photos with AI. I saw a project in Ireland, like these are trained on US photos, and in Ireland they have greener roofs. So the AI doesn't know that kind of different community, which is one aspect of diversity. So I think by thinking of these kind of problems holistically with also our cultural AI view on this, I think we can actually improve these kind of methods as well.
Thank you so much.
Yes, it was answered, but maybe not the exact target. Anyway, I will follow. But I think that as well as we do the more complicated task with AI, we also should think about automate or semi-automate more easy, let's say more current, more everyday task with AI. Thank you.
Thank you.
May I ask a question?
Yes. I'm not sure. I don't see you right now. Oh, Sergio, yeah, go on.
No, I have written it to Vendela, but she mentioned curatorial workarounds and about basically giving more possibilities for a more immersive relation to the digital representative, as I understood. But I also wanted to discuss the fact that institutions do produce critical thinking around their collections into exhibitions and research projects, and a lot of that is also data in text that's present on their holdings, but it's not necessarily connected or directly inserted into the database. And then many times there is a lag of time, between what's being done and it's already there as data, as mediation, that it's not included in the data analysis because you're looking directly to the database. So my question is, will it be needed to include through AI an evaluation of mediated content that's being produced around that documented data sets to then use already that thinking to accelerate the process of reviewing the data self itself, because many times that's already in there. It's intellectual production that's already produced, and we eventually could bring that into the evaluation of biases and all the discussions we had today. Just to mention that I see an issue about critical thinking and transforming that into data review, and that's critical thinking. Maybe it's very, very important for the development of reflections on bias itself. So, yeah.
Thanks so much for bringing that up, Mr. Bergi. Yes, I agree, and in this small case study that I've done, that's absolutely the case. And the institution having organized conferences where and taking on decisions on policy that are particularly targeting the Sami and in social inclusion and precisely these kinds of things. So it would be amazing and important if this knowledge production, just like you're saying, and these current social debates that they are actually actively involved in, if that can be embedded into posts like I shared with you, where all that seems so distant and just another world. Precisely the response of the curator here who added this link to the Nordic Museum. I mean, just small things like this, but they can certainly be expanded as well. I think it's very important. But I will leave it to my colleagues on the tech side to figure out how to do that. Thank you.
And I want to maybe have one last question before we close this session, being aware of all your time limits, and it's Friday. So in your opinion, what guidelines or good practices or standards would you say cultural heritage institutions should follow to make AI more ethical? Any ideas, any good advices there? I see that Clemens, who's also a speaker on the next session, wrote that he's found a recent publication, and he linked it, and he posted the link in the chat. But otherwise, there seems to be a big silence on this question right now. I would suppose that, oh, Marike, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, one of the things that we are working on, that Valentina is also heading, is a manifesto about, you know, AI in cultural heritage. So some of these, you know, good practices, a lot of people have been thinking about ethics in AI. We need to make them more explicit. We need to make our AI transparent. We need to make it explainable. Actually, the Dutch National Library has an AI agenda in which some of these elements are also present. I think we need to think about it, and we need to collaborate. I think that's what gets me so excited about the Cultural AI Lab, and of course I'm biased because I'm part of it, but is that we have these collaborations. And you really see that, you know, also in Mari's presentation and also in Vendela's presentation. It's really, you need to look at it from all these different perspectives to do a good job. And you can't expect every museum professional to also be an expert on AI. And you can't expect every AI expert to also be an expert on cultural heritage. So I really hope that that this has inspired you as well, and that we can work together with loads and loads of different institutions on this.
I think you just made a great roll-up for actually wrapping up this session, because that's exactly our aim with this webinar series, to inspire and to actually also make people aware of the things that they might not know about. So to learn about the things, your own black holes, where your biases, where you as a museum professional or a tech person could actually learn more about. So keep posted. I'm gonna actually post a link to the whole series in the chat now. So if you haven't signed up for our next session, this is going to take place in 2 weeks exactly, with the Curator AI project. I'm gonna see you all again. Keep safe, and thanks a lot to Tamara and Gina, who are helping us behind the scenes to make this a smooth event for everyone. And a special thanks to all the speakers, and I think this is something that is always getting lost with digital meetings. So I hope that you hear me clapping and that you have a good weekend. Thank you so much, Cultural AI Lab, and good luck with your research. Have a nice weekend. Goodbye.